This is something else he wrote on Tom Mix. Remember Tom Mix, the cowboy? That cowboy was doing these wonderful things, and I decided that I should imitate him. I wanted to be the beloved hero of a Hollywood silent movie. A mix of motivations, right? Well, he went to British embassy in Madrid and said, I want to be a spy. Well, they turned him away. They didn't know what to make of him. Well, he decided the British wouldn't take him. He'd have to find, they thought he was crazy. So he was a chicken farmer, a Spanish chicken farmer. So he decided, well, there has to be another way in. He decided he would go to the German embassy, offer himself as a spy. Madrid was teeming with Nazis because of the fascist government. Offer himself, and once he got into England, he would become a double agent. He began studying all about the Nazis, their doctrines. He figured if the Germans accepted him, they would give him a visa to travel to England. And then he said, I could go to the British and pose as a double spy. Well, apparently, he spent 9 months studying British maps. Went to the German embassy in Madrid, and he said, I have a whole bunch of people in England whom I've recruited to spy for you. Gave them a list of names and places which he had copied off the railroad map, all fictitious. And the Germans thought, oh, they were having all kinds of trouble. They had a number of agents in England. The British had a committee of 20 in charge of internal espionage. And the committee of 20 in England is called the Double Cross Committee, XX, okay. They had managed to discover the identities of most German agents in England, and they had turned them against Germany. How had they done that? They approached them. They said, we know you're a spy, that you're working for the Abwehr, German intelligence, and you have a choice. You can either become our agent or you can be shot. What would you prefer? The Germans had 15 Abwehr agents in England. Every one of them was turned. That's why they called it the double cross system. They didn't have a single agent in England. They didn't know it because they were still getting the info, but they had been turned. Well, this looked like a likely candidate. He had his own group of agents, all mythical. He made them all up, but nevertheless he could be a real help. So he said, if Germany could get me a visa to travel to, say, England, I could pose as a newspaper correspondent and become an Abwehr mole in London. They gave him a code name, Alaric, and they sent him to England. Got to England, and he was a little frightened, but nevertheless, I was suddenly acutely aware I was away from home and about to enter an alien land. Would the English be friendly toward me? Would they understand my motives? Well, he arrived in England. They immediately, he didn't like the cold weather, cold outside, icy fears inside. It was crazy. I had no idea what I was doing. Went to British Scotland Yard and made his pitch, and apparently they assigned an agent to him, an MI6 agent, as a liaison, and apparently began working, sending false messages to the Germans, working for the British, but pretending to be a spy, a German spy. And apparently he sent them all kinds of messages, described networks of spies that didn't exist. He was kind of a character out of the movies. He said, it is true, the British officer who liaised with him, it is true to say that Garbo played a very material part. He developed the unique and fanciful espionage organization, which had been the creation of his imagination. So there he was, a double agent. The Germans never sent any more agents into England. Their original 15 had been turned, and now they had this network that he had dreamed up, and they thought, well, they were doing well. All right, now, the Allies are they're preparing for Overlord, the invasion of France. Most amphibious invasions in history have been failures, with a 90% kill rate. The first known amphibious landing was that of Kublai Khan in Japan in 1274, a total flop. The Armada, the Spanish Armada, didn't work. Gallipoli, 1915, you know that was a total disaster. The raid on Dieppe in 1942, another disaster. So the success against a fortified position is impossible, 90% casualties. If the position is unfortified, then there's a chance. North Africa, Sicily, Salerno. They were all amphibious invasions, but against unfortified positions. All right. They were predicting on D-Day 90% casualties. 5 Allied divisions would land. The Germans had 50 infantry and 11 armored. This is Churchill. It won't work, but you must bloody well make it work. Well, apparently, Garbo was involved in persuading the Germans that the invasion was not going to take place in Normandy, it was going to take place in the Pas de Calais. So he used all of his skill to convince them that the real invasion was scheduled not on the day of the Normandy invasion, but the next day, or the week later at Calais. And so this was the deception that he managed to pull off. In fact, he was so successful that he got an award from Hitler, a medal from Hitler. And the British, in order to maintain this mirage, constructed a phony army base opposite Calais. It was made of, tanks were made of cardboard. They had constructed paper planes, all kinds of phony armaments. But from the air, if you came over to look, it looked real. They even had Churchill make a visit to this phony base. And apparently the Germans did surveillance. They did not discover the truth. And so when D-Day came, and it's important with an invasion of a beachhead, what's critical is you must succeed on the very first day. If you don't get a foothold on the first day of the attack, then in fact it's hopeless. So the important thing was to get that foothold on June the 4th. June the 6th, excuse me. Well, he played his role, used all his sources, informed them, please, the invasion is a feint, F-E-I-N-T. They are not, this is not the main part of the invasion. The main part is coming in a day or two from Calais, so remain on guard. Also, who is commanding the forces opposite Calais? Patton. Now, Patton was considered by the Germans to be the greatest general of the Allied armies. And so, apparently, Bradley was commanding the forces at D-Day. Well, why would the Allies choose Bradley over and against Patton? And Garbo's answer was, well, they demoted Patton because he slapped a soldier. The Germans couldn't believe it. That's why they demoted him? Because he slapped a soldier. I guess in the German army you were lucky not to get by with a shot in the head. Couldn't believe it. Didn't make sense. Well, this is the gravamen of the story. He, as the D-Day Armada was nearing the beach, he sent them an emergency, he sent the Germans an emergency telegram through his wavelengths saying, don't be confused. They are going to attack Normandy, but that's only a trial run. The real invasion is still coming at Calais. The Germans had several panzer divisions in the area. They held them back and sent them toward the Belgian frontier to be ready for Calais. Well, this was the great feint that saved D-Day. And this was his contribution. He was mustered out. It was all very hush-hush because there were still Germans who might seek retribution. So he was mustered out of the service in the autumn of '44. And in the end, he left Europe. He went to, I think, Venezuela. He was afraid that what he had done would leak out, and somehow there would be neo-Nazis, even in Venezuela, especially in Venezuela, who might try to even the score. But on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, they decided they would honor him. He came back to London, and he was met by the King and the Queen, no less. They greeted him apparently as on a par with the great heroes. You've heard of Montgomery, you've heard of General Eisenhower. Meet a third individual who was equally responsible for the success of D-Day. And apparently they gave him a British award that had never been given before to a foreigner, an Order of the British Empire, something like that. He had tea with Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. He was honored. He returned to the beaches and explored the beaches with the top brass. Apparently then went back to Venezuela. He mentions in his memoirs that 5 neo-Nazis came knocking at his door one day. He had to change his name. He tried to avoid because so many Nazis were living had escaped to South America, he was still fearful. When he died, I think he died in 1988, so on his grave they have a very simple marker, no mention at all of the fact that he had been so instrumental in the triumph at D-Day. He was, that's usually the fate of successful spies. Nobody knows their name. When you know the names, then you know they failed. Okay? All right, now the last one. Do I have, yeah. I'll take, maybe I might go a minute or two over, so please excuse me if I do. And the last one, of course, is a contemporary, semi-contemporary, and that is the case of Pollard, Jonathan Pollard, and his activities. Okay, and I've tried to do as much research as I can. He apparently was born in South Bend, Indiana, a very small minority of Jews living in a rather tough neighborhood. However, he claims he experienced a great deal of anti-Semitism growing up. However, he went to Stanford. During the Yom Kippur War, he tried to sign up. He tried to volunteer in the Israeli army, but he apparently was turned down. His service to Israel, some claim, became a kind of obsession with him. He became a naval intelligence officer and an analyst for 6 years. He was arrested in November of 1985, convicted of passing American military secrets to Israel. The material that he passed to the Israelis concerned the development of Syrian and Iraqi chemical, biological, and nuclear buildups. Also, missile development and deployment in Syria and Iraq. At the time, there was a treaty between the United States and Israel which provided for full exchange of information. But U.S. naval intelligence selectively decided on what to pass to the Israelis. He, being a naval intelligence officer, was aware of that, and he apparently became very disturbed by the fact that the Defense Secretary, Caspar Weinberger, was attempting to strengthen American position with Arabs and therefore was restricting the flow of information to the Israelis. And I have a statement he made. This is tough. Incidentally, this is a book about Garbo, Agent Garbo, the brilliant, eccentric secret agent who tricked Hitler and saved D-Day, by Stephen Tolte. Okay. Interesting book. Now, this is a statement that he wrote. This is Pollard later in prison. He wrote to a rabbi. The rabbi had written to him and asked him why he committed espionage. This is his own explanation. In retrospect, Rabbi, I know that there may have been other ways in which I could have exposed Weinberger's treachery. At the time, I was so scared of what might happen if the embargoed intelligence did not reach Israel that I threw caution to the winds. Tell me, Rabbi, what would you have done in my situation? Go to the press and run the risk of sensitive information inadvertently linked? Convince yourself that the security of 4 million hard-pressed Jews was worth less than your loyalty to a man who was trying to destroy them. The decision I made may have been illegal, but I honestly thought I was doing something right. Well, he apparently took it on himself to transmit these secrets to the Israelis, and he was found out. And the whole question really is now, was he sincere? He thought back, he said that there was no rescue for Holocaust victims. He did not want it to happen again. No one quite knows whether he was sincere or not. There was always the suspicion that money had been exchanged, although no one mentioned more than about $40,000, which doesn't seem like a huge sum, considering the millions that were exchanged by earlier spies that we've spoken of. So apparently he was guilty. He didn't deny that he had been sending it. There was a private hearing. A grand jury was summoned, and apparently his wife was also arrested the next day on the basis that she was an accessory. In early 1986, he was told that if he would plead guilty, he would not receive a life sentence. He agreed. His wife was ill. She had lost 50 pounds in prison in 3 months. And so they convened a grand jury, and he pleaded innocent. The grand jury never weighed evidence, never came to any conclusions, never made any judgment. Instead, he pleaded guilty on the premise that he would be spared a life sentence. It's interesting that treason was never mentioned until the very moment before the sentencing. In effect, treason is defined as collusion with the enemy. You could have been guilty of treason if you colluded with Germany during World War II. But there was no war between the U.S. and Israel. And so treason was inappropriate. In fact, even the atom spies were not convicted of treason because we were not at war with the Soviet Union. Treason is restricted to contact with not just an enemy, but a declared enemy. A state of war must exist for treason to occur. Well, apparently he was told that he would not receive, if he received a life sentence, there would be no mention of parole. In other words, he would not be excluded from parole. So he pleaded guilty. And no findings were ever brought to the grand jury. They were convened, but it was an in-camera hearing. No charges were brought, no treason, and he just believed the government, saying that they would go, if he pleaded guilty, he would not suffer as much. Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense in the Reagan cabinet, brought in to the judge a 46-page classified memo which detailed his spying. They gave it to, apparently never seen by Pollard's attorneys, gave it to the judge, and at the last minute, 1 hour before the sentencing, they gave the judge a 4-page handwritten supplement. The supplement demanded, quote, the severest punishment possible, commensurate with the enduring quality of treason. That was the basis for an appeal later. Treason is excluded because we were not in a state of war with Israel. Apparently, Weinberger was very angry at Pollard. The State Department was projecting an image of American policy as even-handed, and that, quote, Israel should not be too strong in relation to her Arab neighbors. The Israeli government apparently denied that Pollard had spied for them. Well, you would expect that. And when the judge pronounced the verdict, having this 4-page memorandum, they sentenced him to life without parole. The government reneged. And apparently they announced that he should not get parole. It should be a life sentence. During the period of this episode, mainstream media coverage was very dark. They kept, many of the papers hinted that he was at the center of a much larger conspiracy like the Rosenbergs. The prosecuting attorney, DeGeneva, he later said he was under pressure to find evidence of an Israeli spy ring in the United States, but he never found any such evidence. This was the prosecuting attorney. Time magazine propagated all sorts of innuendo based on the Justice Department leaks that there was, quote, evidence of a broader operation, which was never proved. Well, he was sentenced to life without parole, mainly because of that 4-page memo. His lawyers apparently brought a case to set aside the verdict because he had been promised life. There was no mention of parole when he agreed to plead guilty. Apparently, I'll tell you about what the judge, that court did. But nevertheless, he was sent immediately to a prison in Springfield, Missouri, and confined for 10 months to a ward for the criminally insane. He was removed from the ward at the behest of several members of Congress, confined to a sealed room for 6 months. The director of the Bureau of Prisons said, he is the single prisoner in the United States being treated in such an inappropriate manner. Next, he went to the U.S. Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, the highest security prison in the United States, and he had a basement room for 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. So his treatment was really inhumane. He was not if he were spying, which apparently he was not spying for a hostile country. Nevertheless, they decided in 1991 that that they would renege on the promise. His lawyers tried to reopen the case. The word treason, they said, prejudiced the judge, and it went to an appellate court that had to decide whether to set aside the verdict and have a new trial. And the appellate court voted 2-1 against permitting the retraction of the guilty plea. It's interesting, on that appellate court, Lawrence Silberman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stephen Williams. Stephen Williams voted yes, set aside the plea. He was tricked. But Ginsburg and Silberman voted no. He should say the plea won't be set aside. In other words, they ruled against him. Williams, the one yes vote, said a fundamental miscarriage of justice has occurred. The Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal. He was eventually transferred to a prison in North Carolina. All kinds of efforts to get executive clemency and get him released failed until about a year or two ago. And I think that he was released under various conditions in 2015. Well, the whole case was tried in secret, never went to trial. So it's very difficult to comment on the quality of evidence or of the bias. There was a book that came out after the trial, just about 10 years ago, based on leaks from the Justice Department that was very negative. But on the other hand, there were numerous calls for his release. 570 rabbis referred to him as a prisoner of Zion, like the Sharanskys in Russia. There wasn't much pressure from the Jewish community, however. It's interesting, there seems to have been, and go back to your point, there was unique treatment for Pollard and for the Rosenbergs. And in the case of the Rosenbergs, a death penalty, which had never been applied in such a case before. Fuchs, as I said, got 14 years. The British were, the people in charge of Venona were appalled. They thought it was a desecration of Venona. Nevertheless, I don't know why there was so little protest from the Jewish community in either case. It was relatively little, but nevertheless, a book was published. The press was very negative, and there was at one point a book by a man named Ronald Olive, based on probably Justice Department information. He had a pipeline to the Justice Department. And he writes something in the book like, he probably got money, but it wasn't a lot. And I'll quote directly from the book. It was nothing more than 30 pieces of silver, which has a connotation and an echo and a ring to it. And DeGeneva testified, he was the prosecuting attorney, he was an official of the Justice Department. He said they kept trying to find evidence of a broader espionage ring. There wasn't any that he was aware of, but that was the push, that he was part of an espionage ring, and that Weinberger himself got caught up later in the Iran-Contra affair, and apparently was meted out a prison sentence which was set aside immediately. But nevertheless, it was some sort of, I guess, you can draw your own conclusions. This is contemporary, it's not so much historical. He was released under severe restrictions about a year ago. The Israeli government constantly pressured for his release. They contacted Clinton and Bush, one after another. It was always a problem with foreign policy. Well, we're in the midst of this negotiation with Arabia, we don't want to antagonize them, or we're in touch with the Iraqi government, we don't want to do anything to upset them. So it was always sort of soft-pedaled, even though they actively did consider it, because a life sentence for turning information over to an ally seems a little excessive. But nevertheless, as I say, it's interesting that the Jewish community really did not bestir itself. I think in the case of the Rosenbergs, they did, but they were unaware that, in fact, the Rosenberg spy ring had done such enormous damage. Mostly in the case of the Rosenbergs, it was simply that the death penalty had been used when it had never been used before in such a case. So ask me a question or two before we conclude, all right?
Is there anything positive that happened in the McCarthy hearings? We know about all the negatives from the McCarthy hearings. Was there anything, as a historian, was there anything positive that the House Un-American Activities Committee found?
The McCarthy hearings, he stirred up a lot of people that he named were, on the fringes or maybe not even really too much involved except as peripheral. But the one thing, I think it was Christopher Hitchens, who was an essayist, a great wit. He said the one thing that McCarthy, that people cannot forgive is that McCarthy was right about McCarthy was right. Despite all of the tangential damage that he did, essentially there was a spy ring that operated for years, that obtained very important information, but even more, acted to steer American foreign policy. That, some of them, there's no doubt about the evidence. They attained, some who never were named but are in Venona. The architect who designed Reston, Virginia, for example, is named in Venona. Never charged with anything. There are 5 or 6 others that I could name. But basically, it was a period when the KGB, in effect, was very successful in transferring American technology. It would have cost them millions and millions of dollars to duplicate it. They might have done it on their own, but this was a shortcut, so it saved them enormously. And there were Americans, probably, from the days of the war. After all, the Russians were allied. Joseph P. Davies, who was American ambassador to Moscow during the war, he said something which is really incredible. He said, if we would not share the secret of the bomb with our allies, the Russians, then they had every right to steal it. Extraordinary statement. So, yeah. Okay.
Talk about bollards in Israel. They don't talk about Israel versus the Arab oil as a motivation for doing what they did to him.
He apparently was so scarred by memory of a Holocaust, not that he experienced it firsthand.
I'm talking about the politicians in America, including Weinberg. What was our interest economically? Arab oil. What did Israel have?
Well, that was the
Nothing.
case even going back to Roosevelt. On his return from Yalta, he stopped to speak to the Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia on the way back from Yalta, and he assured him that we would never do anything to antagonize the Arab world. In other words, the Jews who were trying to get to Palestine in the wake of the Holocaust would just be left to molder in camps.
That's been our history. Always oil when it came to the Arabian.
But not so much now.
Now it's changing. Yeah.
Right, not so much now. That's very true, though. Anything else? Okay, one question here.
I have a comment to show you how far-reaching things were during the Joe McCarthy era. I was in my early teens. My sister was maybe 12. One day, unannounced, the FBI came to our home. They showed us pictures of a man at a podium. They wanted to know if we had ever seen him go into the house next door. Oh. The man who lived there was an official in a labor union.
Really?
We later found that my father came home and was, after they had gone, was very, didn't like the idea they questioned young girls. The man at the podium turned out to be the father of Leon Uris.
Of who?
Leon Uris.
Really? The writer? Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Well, what happened to Pollard? I don't remember hearing
He's released under, I think, limited.
Or was it in the news?
I thought Obama refused to pardon.
I think he did, but he's now out. I think maybe for health reasons. I don't know. But he wants to go to Israel. They want him to come, but he's not permitted to go. He can't leave the country.
He had some sort of a computer job that was
Yeah,
arranged. and-
right. Just in 2015 was the end of the case. Okay, yeah.
A few years ago, there was the
I
law
can't
of
hear
spy
you.
ring, which was a very deep-seated spy ring that was involved with submarine service in the United States that sent secrets, I believe, to the Russians. And the question comes, why they were prosecuted and sentenced as harshly as Pollard, and how much anti-Semitism is involved with this? You're familiar with the law of spy ring. And those guys were not punished as severely as Pollard was.
That point has been made over and over again. Also, the conditions of detention. I mean, having solitary confinement in a prison for the criminally insane. You know, just the conditions were, and undoubtedly there was some personal animus. I guess Weinberger and the administration wanted to show that they were even-handed, that they were not leaning toward Israel in any way, shape, or form. His view, and his lawyers never saw any evidence against him. He was never convicted by a jury of treason. He was lulled into this plead guilty, and you won't get life. Well, you won't. No, they didn't say you won't get life. You'll be eligible for parole. That's what they told him. You get life, but you could be paroled, because the number of prisoners with life, and there's been a comparison to more recent judgments by the courts, like John Walker Lind, I think, the one who was captured in Afghanistan, who had converted to Islam, something like that. There was always much lighter sentences for people that were in arms against American troops. But there appears to have been I guess, a charm offensive by the administration toward the Arabs at the time, and they wanted to prove that they were neutral in the contest between Israel and the Arab states. And he was probably the victim of it. But it was excessive, and in many ways, even though the Rosenbergs were guilty, you'd have to say that no one else got the death penalty, especially no woman since 1865. Okay, I'm sorry I couldn't do more. 3 hours for all.